Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a deep dive that looks at, well, one of the really big ecological and economic threats facing us globally. Biological invasions. And we're not talking science fiction aliens here, obviously. We mean invasive species, plants, animals, pathogens that are costing the world, frankly, staggering amounts of money. Hundreds of billions every year.
Yeah, absolutely. And specifically today, we're looking closely at a really key paper by Ross and Cuthbert and several co-authors. The title asks the core question: are the 100 of the world's worst invasive species also the costliest? And this paper, it's important because it gives us the first sort of rigorous economic look at a question that people in conservation have wondered about for, well, about 2 decades now.
Right. That sets up a great mission for us and for you listening. Because, for context, the IUCN, that's the International Union for Conservation of Nature, they put together this really famous, maybe infamous 100 of the world's worst list way back in 2000. And these were picked as, like, the ecological bad guys, chosen because they hammered biodiversity or really messed with human activities. But crucially, not necessarily because of their dollar cost.
Exactly. The list was all about raising awareness, you know, getting people to focus on truly destructive invaders. Think the brown tree snake in Guam or zebra mussels clogging up pipes, things like that. But there was this big unknown, this blind spot. Did being ecologically devastating automatically mean they were the biggest economic drains compared to, well, all the hundreds of other invasive species not on that VIP list?
Right.
Quantifying that difference, that's what this paper really digs into.
Okay, but quantifying that must be incredibly tricky, right? I mean, environmental damage, lost species, that's often stuff without a market price tag. You can't just look up the cost of, I don't know, a vanished ecosystem service on the NASDAQ.
No, definitely not.
So how did Cuthbert and the team even begin to tackle monetizing damage from things as different as, say, feral cats killing native birds versus Formosan termites eating houses?
Well, they knew they needed absolute rigor. So they tapped into the InvaCost database, version 3.0, which is basically the global gold standard repository for invasion cost data.
Okay.
But they were really selective. They filtered everything through some pretty strict criteria. First, all the costs had to be standardized, put into 2017 US dollars, so they were comparing apples to apples.
Makes sense.
Second, the cost estimates themselves had to be what they called high reliability. So basically coming from peer-reviewed studies or official reports, things that could be checked and reproduced. No back-of-the-envelope guesses.
Right, solid sources.
And third, maybe the most critical filter. They only included costs that were empirically observed, actual documented damage or spending that had already happened.
So no projections, no models of what might happen.
Exactly. They threw all that out, only focused on damage that had actually been measured and reported in the past.
That sounds like it must have dramatically shrunk the data set, though. Getting rid of predictions seems bold.
It absolutely did shrink it, but it was necessary, they argued, to make sure they were comparing real, documented economic impacts, not just potential ones.
Okay.
And this strict filtering, it meant they ended up with reliable cost data for only 60 out of the 100 species on that IUCN worst list.
Only 60. So 40 of the supposed worst didn't even have robust economic data attached.
That's right. A big gap we'll come back to. And for the other invasive species, the ones not on the list, they found reliable data for 463 of them in the database.
So 60 worst versus 463 others? That difference in sample size alone is interesting?
It's definitely important context for the findings, yeah.
Okay, let's get to it then. The core finding. The big question everyone wants answered. Are the famous worst 100 species actually costlier than the rest?
Yes, but with a really important how. On average, those 60 worst species are disproportionately costly. But to really grasp the impact, you need to look at the median cost, not the average or mean.
Why the median specifically?
Because invasion costs are, well, all over the place. You might have one species, maybe some agricultural pest, that caused just astronomical damage over decades, like $100 billion. That one outlier would totally skew the average, the mean cost for its whole group.
Okay. Makes the average misleading.
Exactly. The median, though, tells you the cost of the typical species in that group, the midpoint. And when you compare the medians, wow, the difference is pretty stark.
Okay, lay it on us. What's the median comparison?
For the 60 worst species they had data for, the median cost was US $42.9 million.
$43 million. per species, typically.
Now, compare that to the 463 other species. Their median cost was just US 534,000.
Whoa. Hold on. Less than $1 million. 534,000 versus nearly 43 million.
Yep. It's about an 80-fold difference in the typical cost per species.
That's incredible.
And what's fascinating here, what this tells us, is that the original IUCN list, even though it wasn't based on economics, it did successfully pinpoint species whose mechanisms of harm tend to cause consistently high economic damage.
So their ecological impact translates reliably into big financial hits.
It seems so. Their impact is sort of high volume and less varied compared to the other species, where the economic damage seems much more hit or miss, sometimes huge, sometimes minor.
That really validates the IUCN's original criteria, doesn't it? But hang on, there's always a but. When you look at the total documented costs across the whole study period, the picture gets a bit more complicated. The 60 worst species, you said, caused a total of about US $149 billion. But the 463 other species collectively caused slightly more, US $163 billion.
That's the critical nuance, exactly. While the worst are much costlier individually on average, there are just so many more of these other damaging species.
Right.
Their sheer volume means that when you add up all their costs, that total eventually overtakes the total for the smaller group of worst species.
Which points to a potential blind spot in policy, maybe. Focusing only on the famous ones misses the bigger cumulative picture.
Precisely. And it gets even starker. Get this. The study found that the mean cost of just the top 10 most expensive species that are not on the IUCN list.
Okay, the top 10 others.
Their mean cost was US $11.7 billion each. That figure is way higher than the average cost across the entire worst list group, which was about US $2.5 billion per species.
Wow. Okay, so some less famous invaders are actually the single biggest economic nightmares we face, even if the worst list captures species that are more consistently expensive.
That seems to be the case. The conservation spotlight might be a bit too narrow if we're only thinking about dollars.
So who are we talking about here? Can you give us some examples? Who are these heavy hitters, both worst and other?
Sure. From the worst list, the ones with really high documented costs included things like the feral cat, the black rat, classic widespread problems, and also insects like the Formosan termite and the red imported fire ant.
Okay. Familiar villains.
And from the other species list, those less famous but incredibly costly ones included the yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti, the boll weevil impacting cotton, and even common annual ragweed, Ambrosia artemisifolia, due to healthcare costs and agricultural impacts.
Ragweed. Huh. You don't normally think of that in the same breath as fire ants. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. Understanding not just the total cost, but where the money is being lost. Which sectors are hit hardest? And crucially, what are we actually doing about it in terms of management spending?
Right. Breaking down that damage structure is super revealing, and it links right back to how the IUCN list was made. For the worst species, the costs predominantly hit the environmental sector. That accounted for about 31% of their total documented costs.
Which makes sense, given the list focused on biodiversity impacts.
Exactly. It shows that even though these non-market environmental costs are hard to pin down financially, they are genuinely significant when researchers manage to quantify them.
Okay, and what about the other species, the ones driving that slightly larger total cost? Where do they hit?
Overwhelmingly, agriculture. Think crop losses, livestock impacts, controlling farm pests, like the boll weevil example. These costs are often, frankly, easier to calculate because they directly affect market goods, crop yields, commodity prices, treatment costs.
Right, more direct economic lines. Now, the management question. Given these huge costs, you'd hope, maybe expect, that a good chunk of the money tracked would be going towards, controlling these invaders, preventing spread, managing the problem.
You would hope so. But that's where the data gets quite sobering. For both groups, the vast majority of reported costs were just for damages and losses, stuff already gone wrong.
Okay, like cleanup or lost revenue.
Yeah. For the worst species, damages and losses were 72% of their total cost. For the others, it was 61%. So most of the cost is reactive, not proactive.
But what about the proactive part, the management spending?
That's the really shocking part. Proportional spending on management was incredibly low overall. And surprisingly, it was over twice as low for the worst species the supposed flagships we're most aware of.
How low are we talking?
For the worst species, management spending accounted for only 6% of their total recorded economic impact. 6%.
Wait, only 6%. Let me just pause on that. For the 100 species flagged as the world's worst, we're spending only 6 cents out of every dollar of their economic impact on actually managing them.
That's what the reliable observed cost data showed for the 60 species they analyzed.
So 94% of the financial hit is just damage. Cleaning up the mess, absorbing the loss, we're basically paying for the consequences, not the prevention or control.
It really looks that way compared to the other species where management was still low but relatively better at 15% of their total cost.
15% is still not great, but it's way better than 6. That disparity for the worst list is stunning. It suggests, maybe, that the awareness generated by the list didn't translate into proportional funding for solutions.
That seems like a very plausible interpretation. We got good at identifying and talking about the problem for these worst species, but perhaps not at funding the fixes.
Okay, what about geography? Did they see differences in where these costs were being reported or felt most strongly? They could point to maybe where research effort is focused.
Oh, absolutely. Major geographic differences, which often do hint at research biases, when they standardize the costs against GDP to kind of level the playing field between economies.
Right, fair compare.
Costs from the worst species were really heavily skewed towards North America. It accounted for something like 45% of the GDP-qualified costs from those flagship invaders.
45% just in North America. Why so high there?
Well, the interpretation in the paper is that this likely reflects where research capacity and focus are concentrated. Researchers in North America, and maybe Europe too, often have more resources and focus their bioeconomic studies on these high-profile, high biodiversity impact species, the exact kind of species the IUCN list highlighted.
So the list itself might have steered research funding towards quantifying those particular species in those regions.
It's a strong possibility, yeah. And what about the other species, the less famous ones?
Their costs were actually much more evenly spread out geographically when adjusted for GDP. Interestingly, Africa had the highest share of GDP-qualified costs for these other species, about 29%, followed by North America at 25% and South America at 21%. That contrast is really insightful, isn't it? It suggests North America might be focused on its flagship problems, maybe missing some others, while in regions like Africa, the data reflects the huge, pervasive economic drag from maybe less globally famous but locally devastating agricultural pests or health-related invaders.
Yeah, it paints a picture of different regional priorities and perhaps different types of dominant invasion problems, or at least different reporting focuses.
Let's talk about time. The IUCN list came out in 2000. The whole point was to raise awareness and presumably spur action and better tracking. Did it work? Did cost reporting ramp up after 2000?
Oh, it absolutely did. In that sense, the IUCN list was a definite success story for scientific communication and focus. The data shows total reported costs increased dramatically after the year 2000 for both groups.
How dramatically?
For the worst species, the total reported costs per species jumped an incredible 11-fold after 2000 compared to before.
11 times higher reporting. Wow.
Yeah. And for the other species, it also increased significantly, though less steeply, about a 7-fold increase.
So the list definitely put a spotlight on the issue, gave researchers maybe a common language or framework, and likely focused funding toward actually measuring these costs, especially for the worst ones.
It really seems to have galvanized the research community to quantify the problem much more thoroughly.
Okay, so we got much better at documenting the damage bill. But, as we just discussed, the funding for fixing the problem didn't keep pace.
Exactly. That lag is the critical failure point highlighted by the study. While the reported damage costs went up 11-fold for the worst species post-2000, the reported management spending on them only increased about 3-fold.
3-fold versus 11-fold. Ouch.
Yeah. And for the other species, management spending only saw about a 2-fold increase compared to the 7-fold jump in their reported damage costs.
So for both groups, the gap between recognizing the cost and actually investing in control or prevention got significantly wider after 2000.
Alarmingly wider, yes.
Which brings us neatly to this study's major limitation, the elephant in the room we mentioned earlier, that big data gap. So what does this all really mean when we have to admit that even now, 40 of the original 100 worst species still don't have reliable economic cost data?
It means, fundamentally, that everything we've discussed is based on an underestimate, probably a significant one.
Right.
The authors are very clear. A lack of reported costs absolutely does not mean a lack of economic impact.
It just means we haven't measured it well enough yet.
Exactly. It often reflects knowledge gaps. Maybe the impacts are primarily environmental, which are notoriously hard to monetize. Or maybe the species is most damaging in regions that just don't have the resources or capacity to conduct these complex, expensive bioeconomic studies.
So the true total cost of just those 100 worst species is likely much higher than the $149 billion documented for the 60.
Almost certainly. And the true cost of all biological invasions globally is definitely far, far bigger than the roughly $300 billion captured just between these two groups in this study. The problem is bigger than the already huge numbers suggest.
Okay, so let's try to sum this deep dive up for the listener.
Yeah.
The big takeaway seems to be that the IUCN's 100 worst list, while maybe imperfect, was actually pretty successful as a scientific communication tool, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It did identify invaders that turned out to be, on average, much costlier than others. And it dramatically boosted how often we reported and documented those costs after 2000. So awareness, check.
Check. Big success there.
But the critical failure seems to be political and financial. The investment in actually managing these species, especially the worst ones, is lagging desperately behind the rapidly growing damage costs we're now so much better at measuring.
That's the core message, loud and clear. We know from lots of other research that prevention is vastly cheaper than trying to clean up an invasion after it's established.
The old ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. And since this study shows management spending is just dwarfed by the damage costs, particularly for the high-profile worst species, the most cost-effective, sensible long-term strategy has to be a major boost in preventative investment.
Which means what, practically?
It means putting serious money into things like better biosecurity at ports and airports, checking for unwanted critters or seeds. It means stricter rules for things like ballast water discharge from ships, which spreads aquatic invaders, and probably tighter controls on the global trade in exotic plants and pets, stopping them before they get loose.
So the paper is essentially making a hard-nosed financial case. Being cheap on prevention is costing us vastly more in the long run. Our current approach is financially illogical.
Pretty much, yeah. It frames the lack of investment as economically irrational.
Okay, so that leads to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
The paper notes something quite stark. Out of that original IUCN 100 worst list from 2000, only one species has ever been successfully globally eradicated, the rinderpest virus, which caused cattle plague.
Just one success story in over 2 decades.
Just one. And we've seen damage costs continue to explode, far outpacing management spending. So this raises a really fundamental question, I think. Are we globally still treating invasive species mainly as a scientific communication problem, something that just needs better data, more reports, more awareness campaigns? Or do we need to finally acknowledge that it's fundamentally a political funding problem, one that requires governments and international bodies to make vastly greater proactive investments in prevention and rapid response, even if it's politically difficult or requires upfront spending? Where should the real focus be now?